Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, or if you're joining us from West Africa, good afternoon. My name is Judd Devermont. I am the director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And I want to welcome you to this very important and timely discussion on democracy, elections, and COVID-19 in West Africa. It is a real treat to do this in partnership with my favorite think tank in West Africa, the Center for Democracy and Development West Africa, based in Abuja, Nigeria. From now until the end of the year, there will be 5 presidential elections in West Africa, in Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Ghana, and Niger. And there will also be gubernatorial elections in Nigeria and several legislative and local elections in the region. And of course, the big question here is, how do you have free, fair, and credible elections during a pandemic? This is a challenge that everyone in the world is struggling with, but today we're going to focus on West Africa. How do you protect your democracy while also protecting your public from an infectious disease like COVID-19? What are the trade-offs? How do election commissioners, politicians, political parties, and civil societies work with public health professionals to make sure there's sanitizers, to make sure there's temperature guns, to make sure that there's enough social distancing so that you can vote in a safe manner and perhaps even rally and do politicking in a free manner? And if you can't manage it, how do you postpone the election? Do you truncate the election? In my view, there is no right or wrong answer to this question. There are only good and bad processes. You don't want to hasten the election and spread. You don't want to hasten the spread of the disease, but you don't want to postpone the election if that is going to allow a certain figure or leader to expand their time and power. You don't want to have the election if you're doing that so that you ensure that there is going to be a very low turnout. So what I think is important here is that there needs to be a consensus. There needs to be a consensus between parties and with institutions. And frankly, the record in West Africa is mixed. We have seen referendums in Guinea, legislative elections in Mali, local elections in Benin, where there's been a number of questions about what the incumbent's intent was to have that election during COVID-19. There's also been delays. There have been delays of primaries in Ghana, of by-elections in Gambia, of local elections in Nigeria. So today we have really important questions to ask of ourselves and of you, the audience. We need to ask, what has been happening in West Africa since the outbreak has happened? What is the record? We need to talk about the risks and trade-offs for the remainder of the election season, and we have to talk about best practices. Now, I'm going to ask our panelists and speakers and you, the audience, to play the role of a problem solver. How do we have free, fair, credible elections without spreading this disease? And I'm delighted that I could be doing this with my good friend, Adaya Hassan. And I'm going to introduce her, and then she is going to introduce our featured speaker, INEC Chair, Professor Mahmoud Yakubu. So Adaya, if you are not aware, and I'm sure all of our West African audience does, is the director of the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD, an Abuja-based think tank with a focus on developing democracy and development in West Africa. Adaya was formerly the principal program officer and team lead for democracy, democratic governance at the organization. Prior to joining CDD, Adaya was the deputy regional coordinator with the Movement Against Corruption, a movement that seeks to eradicate corruption and poverty in Nigeria. She is a lawyer by profession and a development expert, and she's held fellowships in several universities across Europe and America. Her core interest is in development, and it spans democracy, accountability, peace and security, and justice, transitional justice in West Africa. Adaya, thank you for doing this in partnership with me, and I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you very much, Judd. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Idayat Hassan, as you've already heard, and I'm the director of the Abuja-based Center for Democracy and Development in West Africa. I do hope you are all doing well in these uncertain times, and we are very delighted you are joining us for this conversation. This conversation is organized in partnership with the CSIS. Our colleagues are very good colleagues, to actually look at how we can secure credible elections in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. We all know the pandemic is a health issue, has become an economic crisis, and of course, occurred during a period of a rollback of democracy. How do we ensure that this rollback of democracy or this pandemic itself does not lead to democratic crisis in West Africa for us? In the next 6 months, you've had my colleagues talk about elections that are forthcoming in West Africa. These are very important elections. Some are already contentious, as you will hear later on. And we've also had taste of elections in Mali, in Guinea, and of course in Benin Republic, various elections. And these elections have also given us an idea of what it is to conduct elections during the pandemic, in terms of the extremely voter turnout, low voter turnout, the boycott of elections by the opposition, and of course the health challenge, which is not well documented. But for Guinea, we had the instance of the Senate chair, this is the Independent National Electoral Commission of Guinea, who died after contracting the coronavirus from some observers, really. So these are very important for us, and what we are doing this for is basically to bring you up to date on what is happening in West Africa, what we think will actually happen, what should happen, and what we can do. On that note, I have the pleasure of introducing the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission in Nigeria, Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, to you. Professor Mahmoud Yakubu graduated with a first class in history from the Usman Danfodio University in Sokoto. Aside that, he had his master's degree in the University of Cambridge, got his PhD also from the University of Oxford, all in the United Kingdom. Prior to assuming the position of the chair of INEC, Professor Yakubu was the executive secretary of the Tertiary Education Fund, TED Fund in Nigeria. He was the assistant financial secretary during the National Conference of Nigeria held in 2014. He also taught at the first military school in Nigeria. He taught political history and international relations at the National Defense College. Professor Yakubu, you are welcome.
Thank you very much, Dad. Thank you very much, Judd. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
Professor, would you like to provide some opening remarks to start us off today?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Just by way of opening remarks, let me say how appreciative I am of the duo of CSIS and the CDD for the invitation to speak on this occasion. Let me also say that for us in Nigeria and for the Electoral Commission in particular, we realize how challenging the situation is, but we're determined that our democracy and our electoral process cannot be suspended or truncated on account of the global pandemic. However, quite apart from the general expectation of an election management body to conduct free, fair, and credible elections, this time around, we also need to conduct not only free, fair, and credible, but safe elections. And for that reason, we looked at the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we say in the commission, it's uncharted waters. We are not guided by the experience of any country that has conducted elections, even though of late, there are some that have done so, places like Korea, Mali, Benin Republic, Guinea in our sub-region, and to some extent, for what it is worth, even Burundi. So we are determined to ensure that our democracy is not truncated for this reason. So the first thing we did was to look at the health situation and tried to come up with a policy for conducting elections in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, taking into consideration basically two issues. One, the health situation. How do you conduct elections that are safe for all involved, from those who conduct the elections to observers, to other stakeholders, and most importantly, to the voters. And secondly, the constraint imposed by the economic conditions created partially by the COVID-19 pandemic. Funding for elections in a place like Nigeria is essentially a sovereign responsibility. The state makes provision for the conduct of elections through budgetary appropriations. So we took this into consideration and came up with a policy, and that policy has been shared. I'm sure CDD would have shared it with the CSIS and even more widely beyond the CSIS. And it has basically 10 components, but I'm not going to speak to the 10 components because I don't have all the time to speak to those components. But the first one is the health consideration. And we have received advisory from the health authorities in Nigeria and the health authorities beyond Nigeria on things that citizens should do to keep safe under normal circumstances, including the conduct of elections. We have made the wearing of face masks, for instance, mandatory in the conduct of elections. However, the Commission is not in a position to provide face masks to all the voters that will participate in the elections we are going to conduct, but we will do so for all the staff involved in the conduct of elections. We can come back to this during discussion as to why we are saying so and what other options are available. In addition to the provision of face masks, we are also committed to providing hand sanitizers. It's almost always difficult to provide water and soap in places where elections will hold. To give you an idea, we have two major elections. One is the governorship election in Edo State, and the other one is in Ondo State. The two states have a registered voter population of over 4 million. But in addition, we have 10 by-elections involving over 2 million registered voters. So we have 6.4 million registered voters for whom the Commission is going to conduct either by-elections to fill vacancies or elections to replace those who have reached the end of their tenure. So we'll provide that. Now we use electronic means to accredit voters, and so many people will touch our smart card readers for fingerprint authentication. What are we doing to ensure that voters are safe when they do the biometric authentication? We said we are going to disinfect, particularly the portion of the smart card reader that voters will be required to affix their fingers for voter authentication using methylated spirit to clean up before the next voter touches the machine. We will provide that. We're also going to ensure physical distancing at the polling units to ensure that we maintain either the 2 meter or 6 feet distancing for voters. And at the collation and declaration centers, we'll provide all these facilities in addition to the infrared thermometers. Unfortunately, we can't provide the infrared thermometers at the polling units. The polling units are so many for the elections, over 9,000 locations for the governorship and the by-elections. But we'll provide at the collation center so that we can take the temperature of voters as they move on to vote. The second is planning issues. What have we done as part of the policy to plan for the elections, particularly security for the elections? Because under our own circumstances, security is an important thing. We had a meeting last week with all the security agencies, just as we did with all the stakeholders, the civil society organizations, the political parties, the media organizations. And yesterday I had a chat with our national security advisor, and we're meeting again on Wednesday, having developed a new policy on provision of security or the code of conduct for security personnel that will monitor or provide security for the elections. So we're going to engage big time with the security agencies. We have shared the documents with them. I hope on Wednesday we'll finalize on that one. Voter education is going to be given preference. Not only that, priority attention will be given to that. in the sense that we need to engage. If you have a new policy, the voters involved must know and will continue to engage with the voters accordingly. Training of officials for the election will ensure that we train all the officials that will be involved for the election. The policy makes provision for the training of our officials. Political party activities. Parties will have to conduct primaries, congresses, to nominate their candidates for the election. In one of the states where election will hold on the 19th of September, in the second state, the election will hold on the 10th of October. In Edo, they have already started the processes. 15 out of the 80 registered political parties have indicated interest to participate in the elections. This is not quite like the 90 political parties we had in the 2019 general elections. So 15 political parties will participate, and they have already served notices for their primaries to the commission. We'll monitor that. They will also conduct their activities for the nomination of candidates in the context of the COVID-19 protocols for their own members. But our responsibility will be to monitor those activities. Then we'll accredit their polling agents, we'll accredit observers to observe the elections, we'll also accredit the media for the elections. And consistent with the policy for conducting elections under COVID-19, will deepen the use of technology. For instance, all the stakeholder meetings we have had so far have been done virtually. And this time around, even the accreditation of observers and the media, as well as the polling agents for political parties, will be done online. We have already met with them, and we have told them the processes and shared with them the portal that we have developed to make that happen. The political parties in particular requested for some sort of training for that to happen. Now, the next step will be, how do we intend to implement these protocols and policies in reality? We have come up with a 10-point voter code of conduct for the elections. And this we are going to share widely. I will use it for training. We'll also have posters and other publicity materials at the polling units long before the elections. I don't think time will allow me to go into all the 10 points we have itemized in the voter code of conduct. And I said, we also did the security code of conduct. Now, in implementing this, are there best practices around the world that we can learn from? Yes, we've studied the Korean experience. Personally, I also looked at the Malian experience. I've looked at the experience of Benin Republic. Fortunately for me, until last year, I was the president of the ECOWAS network of electoral commissions. So we have a forum for sharing of ideas and best practices. I have spoken to my colleague in Ghana, Mrs. Mensah. I shared our own policy with her, and she promised to also share their own with the commission. I've been in touch with our colleagues in Sierra Leone, and this morning with the president of the ECOWAS network of electoral commissions, the president of the Electoral Commission of Cape Verde. And I said she should also help us share our own policy with our colleagues in the sub-region, and also make available their own, so that we share experience in that respect. As I said, we'll deepen the engagement with the stakeholders. This is critical. And we have a very vibrant stakeholders in Nigeria, the CDD and others. We have shared with them. They have made some written submissions, and they are pretty good. And that is part of the meeting I was attending early today, and we'll continue later to harvest all the inputs from stakeholder engagements, so that we can now see where we modify or introduce changes to our policy. So we are good to go in Nigeria. There is a policy, it's a new situation entirely. It imposes a lot of responsibilities on the commission to conduct free, fair, credible elections, as well as safe elections for voters. So I look forward, as part of this interaction, to our colleagues from the sub-region to find out from them what they have done, what they intend to do, so that if there are some best practices to share, the commission is always open to doing so. I hope I have not gone beyond my 10 minutes. I think at this point, I would like to sign off, and I'll be available to listen to you and to also respond to questions where necessary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Yakubu. That was very enlightening. We appreciate it. We're going to introduce the panel, but I believe Hidayat has one question for you before we move into the panel.
Okay, I think I'll make it a double-barrel question. One is the use of infrared thermometer. I think we've made a presentation and it remains very, very cogent and a very important one that we really have to adopt if we are going to be putting the safety of citizens as primary. So I think you should still speak more on that. Then two is what happens. This COVID-19 might be an opportunity for the political class to actually game the system in Nigeria. So what happens if we see a reenactment of Kogi or the Bayelsa governorship elections? Will INEC going to suspend the elections, invoking its right under the Electoral Act to do that, or will it continue as usual? And what is the crisis management you have in place, plan you have in place for these elections?
Okay, thank you very much. That first one is about the use of infrared thermometers. It's very important that we do so to measure the temperature of prospective voters and even our officials, bearing in mind that it is part of the protocols, part of the requirements to keep citizens safe in the era of the global pandemic. Yesterday, we had a lengthy meeting of the commission, even though it was a Sunday, and one of the issues we discussed was the protocol associated with the use of infrared. For instance, what happens if pregnant voters turn up and the thermometer reads the 38 and above? Are they going to be turned back because the circumstances in which they are in may mean that the thermometer may read something else? Or others where the reading may be not COVID related, but may actually give the impression that people are also suffering from any of the symptoms of the COVID-19. Now, we will deploy these thermometers, but I'm unsure whether we have the capacity to deploy at polling unit level for a number of reasons. One is the cost. The other one is the turnaround time for voters. Going to do that and do accreditation simultaneously and vote. How is that going to square up? But with the face masks, with the hand sanitizers, with the social distancing, I believe we have covered sufficient ground for us to have confidence and for the people to have confidence that voting can take place safely at the polling units. But by the time we go to much enclosed places for the collation of results and declaration, then we'll deploy the infrared thermometers. They are good, we recommended. We will ensure that this is provided for the election within available resources. Now you talked about the reenactment of Kogi and Bayelsa experience. I have said this consistently, that where elections are disrupted, we should look far beyond the Electoral Commission. I think you put your fingers on the problem, the political class. It's a security challenge. How are you going to reign in the political class? And that's why I said we have been engaging with them. Yesterday, I had a meeting with the National Security Advisor. We are meeting with all the security agencies. But what proactive measure is the Commission going to take to ensure that if there is a replay of what happened in Bayelsa and Kogi, we protect the integrity of the process? We said so after the court order to run elections we conducted since Kogi and Bayelsa, that where the election is disrupted and the Commission cannot vouch for the integrity of the process, will not go ahead to make any declaration. And this we have told the political parties point blank. They either behave for the elections to be concluded in a free and fair manner, or we do what the law says. If we can't vouch for the credibility of the process, there is no point concluding it and making declaration. That we are committed to. But I hope they have learned their lessons in other elections conducted, that there will be a good behavior to ensure that no disruption takes place. Unfortunately, that's the reality in our own situation. You sometimes plan for elections, others plan for something else. But to answer your question point blank, the Commission will not endorse fraud and will not endorse what is clearly outside the minimum standard acceptable for the conduct of credible elections anywhere.
Thank you, Professor. Let me bring in our other panelists, and we're delighted to have two scholars on elections and democracy to join our conversation. And I'll say to our audience at this point, we will have audience Q&A at the end of our events. You can go onto our website at CSIS and you can submit a question for the panelists or for Professor Yakubu, and then we will try to get through as many as possible. But let me introduce Rachel Beatty-Riedel. She is the director of the Naudi Center, and she is the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies at Cornell University. Her research interests include institutional development in new democracies, local governance and decentralization policy, authoritarian regime legacies, and religion and politics with a focus on regional focus, on Sub-Saharan Africa. She was previously an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and a fellow in the Institute for Policy Research and a director of the Program of African Studies at Northwestern University. She has a great new book that just came out on religion, and maybe she can find a way to incorporate that into our discussion. And I am an avid listener of her podcast, Ufuhama Africa. Also joining us is Henry Kwesi Pempe. He is the executive director of the Center for Democracy and Development in Ghana. We'll have to keep the two CDDs, we'll have to figure out how to make sure we're talking about which one. He is a legal scholar and a governance expert, and he has served on the CDD Ghana board since the center's founding and was its first director of legal policy and governance and the co-editor of its quarterly Democracy Watch from 2001 to 2003. Kwesi taught at the Seton Hall University School of Law in New Jersey, US from 2003 to 2015, securing tenure as full professor in 2008. He was also a visiting professor at the law school, the Gempa Law School from 2010 to 2011, and co-taught the Constitution Building in Africa course at the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary since 2014. So let's start with Rachel. Rachel, Professor Yakubu mentioned that he has been following both the elections in Mali and in South Korea, using those as lessons learned. And since you are a scholar who focuses on Francophone West Africa, and we're going to try not to be overly Nigeria, overly Ghana in today's session, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges of holding elections, what we saw in Mali and Guinea and Benin, and perhaps what are the lessons learned as we look towards the rest of the election cycle?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I wanted to lay out, as we think about the election cycle and look back at the examples of Guinea, Mali, and Benin, when we're thinking about best practices, I think there are really kind of three core elements that we want to see vis-a-vis elections. And these are very basic. The first is just participation, right? The participation of the citizenry. And that's the goal when we're thinking about public health. What ways can we allow and catalyze participation without risking the public health of the citizens? How can we help citizens to express their voice and get across their priorities? The second is certainly competition, having an open playing field, letting candidates compete for votes, and that facilitates representation, that citizens see the candidates that they want to represent them out there on the electoral campaign. And the third is, as Judd mentioned, the legitimacy of the process and the results, that at the end of the day, the process and the results are accepted and they're seen as everyone can buy into that and move forward with the election results. So on a procedural level, COVID complicates all of this. And we've seen it in Benin and in Mali and Guinea. On the participation front, certainly being able to use your voice and the space to express your preferences has been highly complicated. In Guinea, for example, the legislative elections and the referendum on the constitution that were held in March were extremely complicated. The election and the referendum were boycotted by the opposition because they were accusing Alpha Condé of trying to find a way to have a third term by changing the constitution and expand his executive power, trying to increase the role and the purpose of the security sector. So people are less likely to want to go out and vote, and particularly given the higher risks with COVID, given these concerns. And when the opposition is calling for a boycott, participation went from 75% in past elections to about 30% overall, and only 15% in the capital city of Conakry. So that shows you when people are deprived of their ability to participate in many fronts, it decreases the legitimacy of the process relating to those underlying concerns. Now, COVID also certainly complicates competition. And we saw this, for example, in Benin, where holding rallies and gatherings over 50 people was banned in the local elections that were held last month in May. And to that end, candidates' campaign schedules were curtailed and controlled to some degree. Now, on one hand, maybe that's good practice. In fact, that's what many have been calling for in other elections, like we see in Malawi right now. But it has to be supplemented with widespread and equitable access for citizens to hear about the candidates and the issues through other means, through radio, through TV, through unbiased newspaper accounts, giving the candidates a real equal opportunity to speak in their own words and to reach the citizens. Now, there's another question related to competition, and that's on what we've touched upon a little bit. Should the election be held or pushed back? In the Benin example, the African Court of Human Rights said that Benin should delay its elections because of the risk that COVID created, but Benin pushed ahead to hold the local elections. Now, many observers in the context saw this as a push for political advantage because two opposition parties were still not cleared to run, and these local elections were really meant to prepare President Talon's re-election bid in 2021. So rather than responding to public health concerns, many saw the pushing ahead with the elections as a real tragedy for the public health issue. But delays can also be interpreted in other contexts with leaders trying to hang on to power. So when there are questions about the date, the process for rescheduling, it creates a lot of uncertainty and then can even lead to a constitutional crisis if it violates constitutional provisions for when the next elections should be held. So electoral delay, for example, contributed to the rising tensions in Mali's legislative elections because these legislative elections were meant to be held since 2018. And they were part of the process of implementing the peace accords. So there was a lot of pressure to go ahead with the elections, yet the public felt that the government suppressed the announcement of the first COVID cases until after the first round of voting was held. So it increased distrust in the process and the sense that people couldn't adequately assess the risk and prepare for it. Now, we've just seen, for example, in Ethiopia, just to bring in a headline that I saw this morning, the Speaker of Ethiopia's upper house resigned today because of the postponement of the parliamentary and regional elections that have previously been set for August. And these elections have purportedly been postponed due to coronavirus fears, but no new date has been decided. So I think it just speaks to this question about timing and delay. It's not necessary that delay is a bad thing, but in terms of the process and the communication and the trust and the integrity of that decision is all very much at stake in terms of making those decisions. Now, the final question is really about the legitimacy of the process and acceptance of the results. In Mali's legislative elections, overall electoral participation was reported at 35%, but in the northern region, for example, in Kidal, reported more than 85% voter turnout, with some deputies elected with 91 or 97% of the vote, which led some to conclude and speculate the possibility of irregularities. So especially when citizens are in a region where they're confronted with a lot of concerns, in this case in Mali, both coronavirus concerns and the concerns that were explicitly threatened by militants to dissuade them from voting, then we have a lot of question over the legitimacy of the process and what the results really mean. So similarly, in Benin's local elections, media coverage was substantially limited, ostensibly due to COVID, but only certain journalists or media outlets were cleared to cover the elections. And these were, perhaps unsurprisingly, only pro-government media sources. So especially in a situation where public rallies are banned, campaign resources is curtailed, citizens need access more than ever to professional and unbiased media accounts. So those are some of the concerns. So what about best practices? Very briefly, I think that Professor Yakubu really mentioned well the kinds of concerns that are taken on voting day. And so I want to extend it a little bit just to think about the pre-electoral process leading up to that moment of voting. The first is to really enhance and support media coverage and access across the entire national territory to diverse and unbiased reporting, and allow direct access of all candidates in an equitable distribution to radios, to TV programs, for the electoral commissions and the like, to be able to get information out to people on WhatsApp and through all of the medium and channels that they use to get information. And the goal might be to make information about voting access and candidate participation the most widely accessible. Now, Mali's an interesting example because related to coronavirus economic concerns, they actually made electricity free of charge for consumers according to a social tariff, which made it perhaps more possible for citizens to access radio and TV, charge up their mobile phones and the like. So thinking about some of those distributional access questions. And then the final point in terms of best practices might be to think about the preparation for and communication around voting access. What are the materials and the protocols that need to be put in place? And particularly when we're thinking about increasing the number of polling stations and the hours open, perhaps even the days open, to de-densify each space. So some polling stations could be open, for example, for days in advance. We've seen this announcement from South Africa, which regularly allows the elderly, the invalid, and election officials to vote in advance of the general population. And that can really help to spread out this process and to perhaps increase trust in the integrity of the vote overall. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. That's a great lay down. We're gonna sort of move from past the elections that we've seen, and we're gonna work our way for the election cycle ending in Ghana. But Adayat, I'd like to focus a little bit more on some of the Nigerian elections. This is your opportunity to respond to Professor Yakubu's opening statement, but I'd love to hear you share how you think some of the best practices that Rachel has just laid out, how they're being implemented for Ondo and Edo and some of the by-elections. And particularly, what is the role of the international community and civil society to work with the INEC to make sure these elections go well?
I think that this is an election, it's a hot take, and for us in Nigeria, this election is one where we really have to be proactive to think that COVID could actually be the decider of the election. It could be gamed to the advantage of the political class. And while INEC has come up with this laudable policy, they are yet to start the full implementation of this policy, this being a very difficult situation. But there is a lot that we really can do listening to the last speaker, and this is very important, particularly in terms of reducing the numbers of people in the polling station. I think that's very, very instructive health-wise, and also to promote participation in these elections. These elections will be determined by three things: INEC itself, the handling of logistics and the full implementation of its beautiful plan. Two, of course, is the citizens, which is the participation aspect of it. With the 15 people number, social distancing, will they be brazen enough to come to the field to vote? And will they even adhere to these principles? And what are we doing? So this is one role for the international community. They have to support INEC more in terms of crisis management communication, in terms of procuring most of all these things that they are trying to reduce on because of the cost implication, in terms also of combating disinformation, which will be a serious determinant of these elections, either to stifle voting, either to disrupt voting on the day of election, or to actually incite violence. That's another issue in itself. Then to punish bad behavior. This is an election that deserves another 1 hour because we know what will happen in Nigeria. So I'm just going to speak in 2 minutes of these elections and what the political class is likely to do to thwart the forthcoming elections in Edo and Ekiti, which are already high-stake elections because of the internal party challenges that the ruling parties are facing in both states. So it makes it high-stake elections, but you can actually be sure and certain that the communication in these elections, people are likely to prioritize the health, the political life, of the politicians instead of the lives of the citizens itself. So punishing bad behavior will be very, very key, not just visa ban to them and their children, but also the tracing of corrupt proceeds and making very strong statements ahead of the elections to prevent what happened in Kogi and in Bayelsa from happening. Then ensuring that the security agencies actively participate in thwarting all forms of violence that can lead to a health challenge, that at the end of the day, we might actually start blaming ourselves that why did we even conduct these elections and not trigger the constitutional provision for an emergency.
Thanks, Hidayat. Kwasi, you've been very patient as we've moved through the panel, but we want to talk about Ghana, and I guess there's a couple of things that are useful to raise. I mean, there has been some primaries that have been delayed already, but as you listen to Rachel and some of the specific issues that Professor Yakubu and Hidayat have raised about Nigeria, what is your sense of Ghana's preparations for their elections? How would you grade the Electoral Commission? Maybe Professor Yakubu needs to talk to his counterpart. We can have sort of a eye-neck to eye-neck conversation after this, but it would be helpful for our audience to get your expertise and experience thinking about elections and how it applies to 2020 in Ghana.
Great. I think we in Ghana would be much happier, probably less anxious, if the foremost concern was the public health part of this problem. Right? If the issue we had to worry most about was the public health issue or the issue of participation and competition. I'm sure we'll get there, but unfortunately for now, we are really grappling with issues of legitimacy, to use Rachel's words, in the sense that we still have a huge dispute on our hands involving certain decisions of the Electoral Commission regarding the conduct of the upcoming elections. So those who have followed Ghanaian politics for some time now would not be surprised at all that as we head towards December 2020 general elections, we face a resurrection of what has been almost a perennial challenge or difficulty in Ghanaian elections, namely who gets to be registered to vote and to vote as a voter. So that issue has arisen again. It was an issue that first emerged in the 2012 elections with the new biometric register that we currently use, which was first put together in 2012. It became a big issue again in 2016 and went to the Supreme Court multiple times before that election was conducted. And the interesting thing is that the two main contenders in this election, which is really a rematch between former President John Mahama and incumbent President Nana Akufo-Addo, have both had some experience with this register. The first time it was used in 2012, John Mahama won that election, which went through adjudication before the Supreme Court, which affirmed his election. And the second time it was used was 2016 and went in the favor of the incumbent President Nana Akufo-Addo by a landslide. So we thought, many Ghanaians thought that the issues about the credibility of that voters register had been settled. After all, the two main contenders had each had one bite at the apple and had each been able to get that election to successfully elect them. So there was a bit of consternation when the Electoral Commission announced last year that it intended to compile a new voters register to replace the existing one. And that's where the controversy began. So even before COVID-19 came in the picture, we were faced with this controversy over whether or not we ought to have a new voters register. And that's where COVID found us. That debate continued. The process to trigger the process for the registration was put on hold, but the debate then continued. The National Democratic Congress, which is the opposition party, immediately objected to the compilation of a new register, and many civil society organizations backed that objection, that there was no use to actually have a new register, that the current register only needed to be updated with new registrants who had come up of age. And that continued until recently. I mean, when the restrictions, started to ease restrictions, the Electoral Commission basically made it clear it was going to go ahead with the registration. So that's where we stand now. The controversy has taken a judicial turn. Not only did the Electoral Commission announce that it was going to go ahead with new registration, but I think even more controversially is the announcement that the documentary proof of citizenship or of eligibility to register that was going to be accepted was going to exclude one of the key documents that had been used in the past, which is an existing voters register. So the new proposed rule by the Electoral Commission would only accept a valid Ghanaian passport, a national ID, which is a work in progress because we do not have a national ID yet. For the first time, we are going through a process of issuing one, and that is a parallel process that has not completed. So some people have been issued with national IDs, many have not. So those two would be accepted, and in the absence of that, you would have to get somebody who is already a registered voter to guarantee for you. So a registered voter could guarantee for 10 different people who do not have either a Ghanaian passport or a national ID. And this issue is now before the Supreme Court in Ghana. So even before campaigns have begun, we have our first case before the Supreme Court. We are waiting the court's decision on that. Now, the way COVID-19 complicates this is that it's really compressed the election calendar considerably, right? So, you know, where in the absence of COVID, we may have had time to sort through these issues and resolve them, whether judicially or in some other extra political fashion, or even through political process. Now, we do not have that luxury. And so the election timetable is really compressed. It normally would take about 86 days for the Electoral Commission to go through all of the processes that need to be done before an election is held. Now we only have about a few months to do that. And this is creating difficulty. So if you add on the fact that we then have to also go through possible adjudication of each one of those decisions, it creates huge complications. So I think, you know, the COVID situation definitely was going to already affect participation, was already going to affect competition, but we didn't really expect that we would have legitimacy issues to worry about. But now that's the foremost issue we have to worry about, because the nature of the relationship between the two parties is such that it's almost a zero-sum kind of game, and it's very difficult to build consensus at this point between the two parties. So if the Electoral Commission, we are just waiting for the Supreme Court essentially at this point as the final arbiter. If it comes out to say that the voters' ID that we currently hold is good enough as one of the documents we could use to establish eligibility, that is likely to tame tensions considerably, because that's the demand of the opposition party. On the other hand, if the court comes to affirm the decision of the Electoral Commission that it's going to accept only a national ID or a Ghanaian passport, or in lieu of that, a guarantor system, which the opposition party strongly opposes, then we do not know what's going to happen, whether or not there's going to be an attempt to not even participate at all in the registration, whether there's going to be a boycott. All of those things are up in the air at this point.
Kwasi, thank you so much. And we're going to be following very closely how the issues around the election registry are resolved. We're going to move to questions, and thank you everyone who's submitted questions. Professor Yakubu, of course, the first question is for you, and it's from JT, who is at this US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He asks, international election observers, particularly the IRI NDI mission, concluded that Nigeria's political parties were the major problems in terms of insecurity, vote buying, and undermining access to the polls. There are future plans from USAID and other donors to move away from political party work in Nigeria. So the question that he asked is, what has happened in terms of reform to the participation of political parties in elections, particularly against political parties and candidate agents at the polls? And I think this nicely mirrors some of the things that Adayat raised in her comments as well. Sir?
Okay, thank you very much. In 2019, we had 91 political parties, 73 participated in the presidential election. Since then, based on the provisions of the Constitution, some of the parties have been deregistered. Now we have 18. So 18 is a bit of a more manageable number for the Electoral Commission for logistics and other things, but also for us to properly keep our eyes on the processes. The problem often starts with the conduct of party primaries by political parties. The Electoral Commission conducts secondary election. Political parties conduct primary elections, and they put forward the candidates for the elections. And they tend to be very, very acrimonious. So when I met with the political parties on Monday, I let them in no doubt that it's not going to be business as usual in terms of the conduct of the party primaries. They are going to start very soon in Edo State, if they have not started already. And then to increase transparency, I noticed that one of the parties is posting the credentials of the candidates to participate in the election for open scrutiny by citizens, both in Edo State and at the national headquarters of the party in Abuja. But it has been a recurring decimal to give you an idea of what we faced in the 2019 general elections. We had more court cases challenging the nomination of candidates by political parties. Then we had legal challenges to the conduct of the main election itself. Of course, INEC Nigeria is one of the most litigated against public institutions in the country. In the last 1.5 years, over the conduct of the general election and party primaries, we have been dragged to court over 2,000 times and is counting. In fact, one of the judgments was delivered only yesterday, and another one is scheduled on Thursday this week in the next two or 3 days. Yes, there are some organizations like the IRI and the NDI which have been helping in reaching out to political parties, in engaging with them. We'll continue to engage with the political parties. I think related to the attitude of the political parties in terms of elections is also gender representation. I was looking at the number of people that have been put forward by some of the parties as aspirants for the elections, at least in the case of 2 political parties. And I didn't see the name of a single woman as an aspirant, not even a candidate for the elections. Again, we are going to engage with the political parties in that respect. But the management of the affairs of the political parties is a big issue, not only for us in Nigeria, but in my experience in the sub-region as well. But with the support of the IRI and the NDI, will continue to engage with the political parties. The problem always is when parties see no difficulty dealing with their own members in the way they deal with them before party primaries, they will have no qualms dealing with the opposition that in some cases they consider as enemies. So we are going to also focus attention on the conduct of primaries by political parties and the outcome of the conduct of primaries, because usually what happens at party level spills over to the secondary elections. We'll continue to talk with the political parties. We'll continue to push for reforms, but political parties are sometimes a different kettle of fish to deal with in the emerging democracies.
Thank you, Professor. That was an excellent answer. We had got a bunch of questions, and of course, we're already running short on time. As Adayat said, we could do just a whole hour-long event on the by-elections and the gubernatorial elections in Nigeria, but I'm gonna put together a couple of questions for Kwasi, and then I'm gonna ask Rachel to follow up and hopefully in the time remaining, give us a preview of some of the Francophone elections that are coming up, or at least what we should be watching. So Kwasi, there was a number of questions around the way electoral commissions are operating. One question from we'll go to Martins from the Citizen Rights for Justice and Accountability. It was about manual voting. And is this time to move away from manual voting? How do we think about electoral voting? And then I think there's a second question from Chris Day, who is from the UK Foreign Commonwealth Office, which is about, what are the ways in which we think about giving people time and space to vote, and where you think are the best ways to do it, building on Rachel. And then we'll again end with Rachel, just to, if you have anything to build on the comments that you've heard, but with Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea and Niger, what are the things that people should look out for? Kwasi, let me go to you first.
So in Ghana, at least, the default is biometric registration and voting. So we moved from manual to biometric in 2012 and stayed with biometric in 2016. So manual is used only in those exceptional instances where the biometric register fails for some reason, where it fails. And there is agreement among the party agents, then you can actually be verified manually. Otherwise, the norm currently is biometric registration, and that is also what the EC is trying to replace. So it's replacing the current biometric registration with another one. So the issue is not the technology as such. I think with Ghana, the issue is a more structural problem with trust for the Electoral Commission because of the mode of appointment of the commissioner. And unfortunately, we have a situation in Ghana where the last Electoral Commission that superintended the 2016 elections were essentially all removed by an impeachment process shortly after the election. So in 2018, the chair of the Electoral Commission and the two deputies were removed through an impeachment process initiated by a citizen with a petition. And under our constitution, the president almost single-handedly, without consultation with the opposition party, there is no bipartisan consensus, gets to choose, just to fill all the vacancies on the Electoral Commission almost single-handedly. So that's what happened in July of 2018. The current Electoral Commission was single-handedly chosen by the incumbent government. So there's a structural, almost a constitutional design problem that has been built, where it's difficult for the party that is in opposition when an Electoral Commission is appointed to believe that the Electoral Commission is going to be impartial. And I think this is what we're faced with, and it hasn't helped that the Electoral Commission has made these decisions about the new register, which is wholeheartedly supported by the incumbent party and wholeheartedly rejected by the opposition. So I think our problem is not a manual versus biometric problem. It is more a structural problem of the mode of composition of the Electoral Commission and the total absence of any bipartisan consensus in that process or participating in that process. In terms of like I said, we really haven't even gotten to have a conversation around how we're going to do the protocols around voting. It's still the politics of the voter registration that has engaged us. But at the minimum, we expect Ghanaians are already getting quite used to wearing masks all over the place, to using hand sanitizers. And we already have allowed 100 people to gather. So the churches are open to the extent they can have only 100 people. So we're getting used, at least incrementally, to this whole idea of wearing the mask and physical distancing and social distancing. So we expect, of course, that the election will follow those same protocols, but it's not a conversation that we have been we in Ghana are fortunate to have at this point. We're still really fighting over issues of voter registration, credibility, EC trust, and legitimacy. Thank you, Kwasi.
Rachel, the impossible task of summarizing every other election in less than a minute. Go.
Well, I'll just say it's going to be a very busy season, building on an already busy start to the year in really difficult and challenging circumstances because of two main factors. And one is building on Kwasi, who has already illuminated for us in Ghana, and that's the question of the legitimacy of the process, in particular about the trust in the Electoral Commission and who is on the voter roll. So if we look forward to Côte d'Ivoire, that is the key question. You know, the question of ivoirité, who is going to be allowed to vote and what the stakes are over that. So we know that that the president has said that he will not run. That's a huge relief, but the tensions remain very high, and it's over, I kind of think the parallel to the Ghana situation there in terms of the concerns over voter roll is very important. In Burkina Faso, there's a parallel public health crisis, and the public health crisis is the security situation. So whether or not people go out to the polls and whether or not there's turnout and they can participate is fundamentally premised on this question of security. And the integrity of the electoral process will be related to that in the sense of already there's question over the review of the districting, which has to be revised and forged a consensus around because so many people have been displaced, particularly from the center and the center north. So those are the questions on the table. In Guinea, we've already seen that the referendum that just passed in this very contested legislative election, and the referendum sets the table for a third term for President Condé. So that will raise a lot of issues and concerns about that election. And he has also been very involved in reshaping the Electoral Commission for increasing control. So the institutional basis is in question. And finally, in Niger, to wrap up very briefly, it's actually an interesting contrast in that there's also the question about insecurity that places like Burkina are facing, but and the opposition is also refusing to take up their place on the Electoral Commission. But President Issoufou has said he will not seek a third term. He will not change the constitution. And so his party has already selected a successor. He'll probably maintain very close links with that successor and continue to be involved, but they're hoping for the process to run very smoothly to be able to line up that succession plan.
Rachel, that was masterful. Thank you. Let me thank our guests and our panelists, particularly first and foremost, INEC Chair, Professor Yakubu. Let me thank Rachel and Kwasi, and then my partner in crime today, Adayat. It is a true pleasure to be able to do this in partnership with CDD West Africa. For those of you just waking up on the West Coast or of the United States or in the East Coast, you can watch this again. It will be on our website. And we're looking forward to having more conversations about COVID-19, democracy, and elections throughout the region. So thanks to everyone and have a great day.